Hey everyone, Nikki here with the Inside Story, and today I'm reading Chapter 4 of A Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. The rose petal just fell out. So every time I get flowers, I take a petal of it and I put it in one of my books, so I get a little surprise when I open it. Alright, Chapter 4, The Bastard God of Fortune. The alchemist and the librarian, they couldn't have been more different, as though Shrest, the bastard god of fortune, had stood them side by side and divided his basket of gifts between them. Every gift to Thyron Nero, one by one, until the very last, which he dropped in the dirt at Laszlo's feet. Make what you can of that, he might have said, if there were such a god, and he was feeling spiteful. To Thyron Nero, birth, wealth, privilege, looks, charm, brilliance, and to Laszlo Strange, to pick up and dust off the one thing left over. Honor. It might have been better for him if Nero got that one too. Like Laszlo, Thyron Nero was born during the war, but war, like fortune, doesn't touch all folk with the same hand. He grew up in his father's castle, far from the sight and smell of suffering, much less the experience of it. On the same day that a gray and nameless infant was plunked on a cart bound for Zemanon Abbey, a golden one was christened Thyron, after the warrior saint who drove the barbarians out of Zosma. In a lavish ceremony, attended by half the court, he was a clever, beautiful child, and though his elder brother would inherit the title and lands, he claimed all else: love, attention, laughter, praise, and he claimed it loudly. If Laszlo was a silent baby, harshly raised by resentful monks, Thyron was a small, charming tyrant who demanded everything and was given even more. Laszlo slept in a barracks of boys, went to bed hungry, and woke up cold. Thyron's boyhood bed was shaped like a war brig, complete with real sails and riggings, and even miniature cannons, so heavy it took the strength of 2 maids to rock him to sleep. His hair was of such an astonishing color as the sun in frescoes, where you might stare at it without burning out your eyes. It allowed to grow long, though this was not the fashion for boys. It was only cut on his 9th birthday to be woven into an elaborate neckpiece for his godmother, the queen. She wore it, and to the dismay of goldsmiths spawned a fashion for human hair jewelry, though none of the imitations could compare with the original in brilliance. Thyon's nickname, the Golden Godson, was with him from his christening, and perhaps it ordained its path. Names have power, and he was, from infancy, associated with gold. It was fitting, then, and that when he entered the university, he made his place in the College of Alchemy. What was alchemy? It was metallurgy wrapped in mysticism, the pursuit of the spiritual by way of the material, the great and noble effort to master the elements in order to achieve purity, perfection, and divinity. Oh, and gold. Let's not forget gold. Kings wanted it, alchemists promised it, had been promising it for centuries, and they achieved purity and perfection in anything. It was the purity and perfection of their failure to produce it. Thyron, 13 years old and sharp as the point of a viper's fang, had looked around him at the cryptic rituals and philosophies, and seen it all as obfuscation, cooked up to excuse that failure. Look how complicated this is, alchemists had said, even as they made it so. Everything was outlandish. Initiates were required to swear an oath upon an emerald said to have been pried from the brow of a fallen angel. And when presented with this artifact, Thyron laughed. He refused to swear on it, and flat refused to study the esoteric texts, which he called the consolation of would-be wizards cursed to live in a world without magic. You, young man, have the soul of a blacksmith, the master of alchemy told him in a cold rage. Better than the soul of a chatelaine, Thyron shot back. I would sooner swear an oath on an anvil and do honest work than dupe the world with make-believe. And so it was that the Golden Godson swore his oath on a blacksmith's anvil instead of an angel's emerald. Anyone else would have been expelled, but he had the queen's favor, and so the old guard had no choice but to stand aside and let him do his own work in his own way. He cared only for the material side of things, the nature of elements, the essence immutability of matter. He was ambitious, meticulous, and intuitive. Fire, water, and air yielded up secrets to him. Minerals revealed their hidden properties, and at 15, to the deep dismay of the would-be wizards, he performed the first transmutation in Western history. Not gold, alas, but lead into bismuth, and did so, as he said, without recourse to spirits or spells. It was a triumph for which he was rewarded by his godmother with a laboratory of his own. It took over the grand old church at the great library, and no expense was spared. The queen dubbed it the Chirospocium, from Chirospoi, the transmutation of base metal into gold, and she wore her necklace of his hair when she came to present it to him. They walked arm in arm in matching gold, his on his head, hers on her neck, and soldiers marched behind them, clad in gold surcoats commissioned for the occasion. Laszlo stood in the crowd that day, awed by the spectacle and by the brilliant golden boy who had always seemed to him like a character from a story. A young hero blessed by fortune, rising to take his place in the world. That was what everyone saw, like an audience at the theater, blissfully unaware that backstage the actors were playing out a darker drama, as Laszlo was about to discover. It was about a year after that. He was 16, and he was taking the bypass through the Toon Walk one evening when he heard a voice as hard and sharp as an axe fall. He couldn't make out the words at first and paused, searching for the source. The Tomb Walk was a relic of the old palace cemetery, cut off from the rest of the grounds by the construction of the astronomer's tower. Most of the scholars didn't even know it was there, but the librarians did, because they used it as a shortcut between the stacks in the reading rooms in the base of the tower. That was what Laszlo was doing, his arms full of manuscripts, when he heard the voice. There was a rhythm to it, and an accompanying puncturing of slaps or blows. Thwop, thwop. There was another sound, barely audible. He thought it was an animal, and when he peered around the corner of a mausoleum, he saw an arm rising and falling with a steady, vicious thwop. It wielded a riding crop, and the image was unmistakable, but he still thought it was an animal that was being beaten, because it was low and cringing, and its bitten-off whimpers were no human sound. A burning anger filled him. Quick as the strike of a match, he drew in breath to shout, and then he held it. There was a little light, and in the instant it took his voice to gather up a single word, Laszlo perceived the scene in full. A bowed back, a crouching boy, glaive light on golden hair, and the Duke of Val beating his son like an animal. Stop, Laszlo had almost said. He held in the word like a mouthful of fire. Witless, thwop. Imbecile, thwop. Lackadaisical, thwop. Pathetic. It went on, merciless, and Laszlo flinched with every thwop, his anger smothered by a great confusion. Once he had time to think, it would flare up again, hotter than before. But in the face of such a sight, his overwhelming feeling was shock. He himself was no stranger to punishment. He still had faint scars crisscrossing his legs from all of his lashings. He'd sometimes been locked in the crypt overnight with only the skulls of dead monks for company, and he couldn't even count the number of times he'd been called stupid or worthless or worse. But that was him. He belonged to no one and had nothing. He had never imagined that Thyon, Nero, could be subject to such treatment and such words. He had stumbled upon a private scene that belied everything he thought he knew about the Golden Godson and his charmed life, and it broke something in him to see the other boy brought low. They weren't friends. They would have been impossible. Nero was an aristocrat, and Laszlo so very much wasn't. But Laszlo had many times fulfilled Thion's research requests, and once, in the early days, when he discovered a rare metallurgical treatise he thought might be of interest, Nero had even said, "Thank you." It might sound like nothing, or worse, it might appall that he only said it once in all those years. But Laszlo knew that boys like him were trained to speak only in commands, and when Thyon had looked up from the treatise and spoke those simple words with gravity and sincerity, "Thank you," he had glowed with pride. Now his stop sat burning on his tongue. He wanted to shout it, but didn't. He stood rooted, pressed against the cool side of the mossy mausoleum, afraid even to move. The riding crop fell still. Thyon cradled his head to his arms, face hidden. He made no more sound, but Laszlo could see his shoulders shaking. "Get up," snarled the Duke. Thyon straightened, and Laszlo saw him clearly. His face was slack and red, and his golden hair stuck to his brow in tear-damp strands. He looked a good deal younger than 16. "Do you know what she spent on your laboratory?" demanded the Duke. "Glass blowers all the way from Amaya, a furnace built from your own plans, a smokestack that's the highest point in the entire city, and what have you to show for it all? Notes? Measurements?" "Alchemy is notes and measurements," protested Thyon. His voice was thick with tears, but not yet stripped of defiance. "You have to know the properties of metals before you can hope to alter them." The Duke shook his head with utter contempt. Master Lusigny was right. You do have the soul of a blacksmith. Alchemy is gold. Do you understand me? Gold is your life now. Unless you fail to produce it, in which case you'll be lucky to have a life. Do you understand? Theon drew back, stunned by the threat. Father, please, it's only been a year. Only a year? The Duke's laugh was a dead thing. Do you know what can happen in a year? Houses fall. Kingdoms fall. While you sit in your laboratory learning the properties of metal? This gave Theon pause, and Laszlo too. Kingdoms fall? But you can't expect me to do in a year what no one has ever done before. No one had ever transmuted metal either, and you did it at 15. Only to bismuth, the boy said bitterly. I am well aware of the inadequacy of your achievement, spat the Duke. All I've heard from you since you started university is how much smarter you are than everyone else. So be smarter, damn you. I told you you could do it, I assured her. I am trying, father. Well, try harder. This the Duke bellowed. His eyes were very wide, the white showing in a full ring around his irises. There was desperation in him, and Laszlo in the shadows was chilled by it. When the queen had named the Chirospocium, he had thought it a fine name for an alchemical laboratory. He'd taken it in the spirit of hope that the greatest ambition of the art might one day be realized there. But it seemed there was no one day about it. She wanted gold, and she wanted it now. Theon swallowed hard and stared at his father. A wave of fear seemed to roil between them. Slowly and all but whispering, the boy asked, What if it can't be done? Laszlo expected the Duke to lash out again, but he only gritted his teeth. Let me put it to you plainly. The treasury is empty. The soldiers cannot be paid. They are deserting, and our enemies have noticed. If this goes on, they will invade. Do you begin to see? There was more. Disastrous intrigues and debts called in, but when it added up to was very simple. Make gold or Zosma will fall. Laszlo watched Theon go pale as the whole weight of the kingdom settled on him, and he felt it as though it were on his shoulders. And it was. Not because it was put there by a cruel father and a greedy queen, but because he took it, right there in the tomb walk, as though it was a real physical burden. He put himself beneath it to help Theon bear the weight, even if Theon didn't know it. Why did he? He might have turned aside and gone about his evening and his life giddy with relief that such burdens weren't his to bear. Most would have. Moreover, most would have hastened hints to whisper of it and spread the rumor before night finished falling. But Laszlo wasn't most people. He stood in the shadows, furious with thought. He was thinking of war and the people the last one stole from him before he could name them, and all the children the next one would orphan, and all the names that would die like songs. Though through it all, he was highly sensible of his own uselessness. How could he help the Golden Godson? He wasn't an alchemist or a hero. He was a librarian and a dreamer. He was a reader and the unsung expert on a long-lost city no one cared a thing about. What could he possibly... And then it came to him. He wasn't an alchemist. He was an expert on a long-lost city no one cared a thing about. And it happened that that city, according to its legends, had been practicing alchemy back when Zosma was still a barbarian-plagued wilderness. In fact, the archetypal images of the art and its practitioners came from the old stories brought across Elimelech, tales of powerful men and women who had tapped the secrets of nature and the cosmos. Laszlo thought about it. He thought about it as Theon and the Duke left the tomb walk in tense silence, and as he returned his armload of manuscripts to the library, and he kept thinking about it as the library closed for the night, he missed dinner to return to his room and his books. While resident scholars lived in the grand guest chambers of the palace's upper stories, librarians were housed in the service quarters, one floor above the housekeeping staff. In the rooms once occupied by ladies' maids and valets, Laszlo entered a long, low-ceilinged passage with many identical doors, each with a glaive hanging on a hook. He took his down and brought it to his room with him. Glaives are quarried stones, naturally and perpetually luminous, and they emitted no heat, only radiance, the color and strength of which varied as greatly as the quality of gemstones. This one was poor, an irregular hunk of reddish rock emitting a muddy glow. Small as the room was, it left the corners in shadow. There was a narrow bed on one side and a desk and stool on the other. 2 wall pegs held every item of clothing Laszlo owned. And there was no shelf but the window ledge. His books were lined up there, and he hung up the glaive and started pulling them off and flicking through them. Soon he was sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, marking pages and jotting down notes. Footsteps passed in the corridor as other librarians turned in for the night, but Laszlo had no awareness of them, or of the descending silence, or the rise and fall of the moon. Sometime into the night he left his room and made his way down to the dusty sublevel that hadn't been dusty for years. It was his sanctuary, a realm of stories, not just from the unseen city but the world. Weep might have been his dream, but he loved all stories and knew every single one that resided here, even if he'd had to translate them from a dozen languages, with the help of a dictionary and grammars. Here, captured between covers, was the history of the human imagination, and nothing had ever been more beautiful or fearsome or bizarre. Here were spells and curses and myths and legends, and strange the dreamer had for so long fed his mind on them, that if one could wander into it, they could discover a fantasia. He didn't think like other people, he didn't dismiss magic out of hand, and he didn't believe the fairy tales were just for children. He knew magic was real, because he'd felt it when the name of the unseen city was stolen from his mind. And as for fairy tales, he understood that they were reflections of the people who had spun them, and were flecked with little truths, intrusions of reality into fantasy, like toast crumbs on a wizard's beard. He hoped this might be one such crumb. At the heart of alchemy was the belief in his oath, the secret essence inherent in all matter. Alchemists believed that if they could distill it, it would enable them to master the underlying structures of the physical world, to transmute lead into gold, derive a universal solvent, and even an elixir of immortality. It had long been accepted that this would be accomplished by means of some elaborate process involving the elemental trinity, salt, mercury, and sulfur. An absurd number of books and treatises have been written on the subject, considering the utter absence of empirical evidence. They were full of diagrams of dragons swallowing suns and men suckling at the breasts of goddesses, and Laszlo thought them as wild as any fairy tales, although they were shelved more respectably in the alchemy room of the library, which tellingly had once been the palace treasury. Meanwhile, banished below stairs where no alchemist would ever look for it, is a book of tales from the unseen city whimsically titled Miracles for Breakfast. There is mention of another theory, that the alchemist was himself the secret ingredient, that only the conjunction of human soul with elemental soul could give birth to Azoth, and there it was, a crumb on a wizard's beard. Perhaps. Alright guys, that was chapter 4, so I will be here tomorrow for chapter 5 of Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. Thanks guys.